1. This happened a good 10 years ago or more. I used to work for an oil distributor. I had my own little office that was right off the front lobby, and my office had a big cutout faux window that allowed me to see and greet anyone who walked into the lobby. There was also a front counter in the lobby, which another guy usually sat at. At any given time there was usually at least 2 men in the front office, but on this particular day, I was the only one in the general area. All the men were outside working. There I was, sitting at my desk in my little office, and in walks this woman. She was peculiar looking. She was wearing a purple sweatshirt and sweatpants, had crazy frizzy hair, and the thing that stuck out to me the most was a mole on the side of her nose, like a cartoon witch might have. I remember thinking that as soon as I saw her, and still remember that damn mole now. Now our usual customers were farmers, truck drivers, mechanics, that sort. However, one of the owners of the company had built some storage units next door and instructed the patrons to come pay the rent to his daughter, who was working in our building. So, at that time, we'd start seeing some unusual folk. When the frizzy-haired woman first walked in, I immediately noted something odd about her, but I assumed she was there about a storage unit. The woman was breathing very hard, as if she'd been running. She looked at me and said, "Hi. I've been walking a long way. I'm walking to Washington, D.C. Can you tell me which way Washington is?" Okay. Definitely wasn't expecting that, but she seemed pleasant enough. I pointed in the general direction of the interstate, but told her that it ran north-south, so I wasn't sure if that would be the best route for her to get to D.C. She rambled a bit more, basically repeating herself about walking, how far she'd walked. She said she'd been walking since Texas. She then asks me if it would be okay if she rested for a minute in front of our building before she set back out walking. As she is rambling, she is walking across the lobby towards my cutout window. I did not think much of it, and when she asked about resting in the yard, I told her that would be fine, thinking she would only be there a minute. I mean, DC is probably almost 1,000 miles away. She can't afford to loiter for too long. Am I right? So I say, sure, you can rest in the yard, thinking she would head that way. At this point, she is standing directly in front of the cutout window that separates my office from the lobby. But she does not leave. Instead, she leans the top half of her body through the window, so that she is now leaning over my desk, and she hisses at me, 666. And then she starts speaking in tongues. Let me just add a disclaimer right here that I am not what I would call a spiritual person and don't particularly subscribe to any beliefs about the devil and whatnot. You know the expression, blood ran cold? I had never experienced it before and have not since, but in that moment I can say with utmost certainty that my blood felt like it turned to ice in my veins. She continued hissing in what may have been gibberish. It didn't seem like gibberish, but I couldn't place it as a language I recognized. And I realized I was slowly backing away in my rolling desk chair. In between the gibberish, she spouted off a few English words, but the only thing that stuck out enough for me to remember was my children. At this point, I realize I am basically trapped, because she is standing closer to my office door than I am. I would have to walk around my desk to get to the door, and I have absolutely no idea what to do. I don't know what's going on with this woman, but I felt that I was in some kind of danger, in a way I had never felt before. Suddenly I hear footsteps coming up the hallway. One of the men who worked in an office down the hall was coming up to the lobby. Crazy lady must have heard the footsteps too, because she retreated back to the front door. But before she fled, she looked back at me and exclaimed, "My children know the truth." I was up, out of my chair, and reached my office door right as a coworker rounded the corner around the hallway. At that point I was in tears. I explained the best I could what she had said and done. He, being a dude, thought that the whole thing was kind of amusing, but said he would call the cops. I suggested a priest might be more appropriate, but that was also laughed off. The woman stood in our yard for a good half an hour, scratching her face and arms and pulling on her hair, yelling God knows what. The cops finally showed up to talk to her, and she acted perfectly normal while they were there. They did not arrest her then, but must have asked her to leave. I was told by other people later that day that she had been standing on the street corner just down the road yelling at cars. And then the police finally did arrest her. Hopefully they took her to a psych ward. I wonder what happened to her, if she really was from Texas, really walking to DC. If she ever made it or wound up in a loony bin somewhere. 2. Okay, so I'm an historical reenactor. That's kind of an important part of this story. I'm also a nurse, ex-soldier, and a bunch of other perfectly normal things. But I do have this one slightly off-center hobby, where I dress in clothes about 600 years out of fashion, and sometimes try to hit people with a very large piece of steel, while dressed as a hood ornament. Now, someone really needs to write a psychological thesis on the subject, but for some reason people dressed in historical clothes somehow become exempt from the usual social norms regarding sexuality and appropriateness. If you are dressed and armoured as a Viking and wandering the streets of central Sydney, women will let you pick them up and carry them away from their friends without a word of protest. Try it in everyday clothes and you'd be tasered within seconds, right? And it works the same for women in armour too. Otherwise, normal men respond to armoured women in bizarre ways that are utterly outside the normal range of everyday human interaction. I don't know the full explanation for it, but it just seems to be the way that people are wired. So I was at a particularly prominent and large medieval festival, or fair for my American readers. The atmosphere was very immersive, and members of the public were encouraged to dress the part, while the 400-odd genuine reenactors performed a range of ye olde activities around the grounds and spent the rest of the time wandering about, lending an element of medieval colour to the proceedings. Armoured, I'm pretty cool, if I do say so myself, but my 15th century civilian clothing is to die for. Crimson slashed silk doublet over black thigh-high boots with spurs, and a pearl earring. And so I was wandering around the event one evening, being dashing and medieval and interacting with the general public, as we are encouraged to do. And yeah, I'll admit it, being a little flirty and taking mild advantage of the aforementioned sexuality appropriateness disconnect. That seems to take place when women are talking to a guy dressed a bit like Colin Firth in Shakespeare in Love. Here comes the disaster bit. After having fought and wandered and given 2 lectures, by the evening I was getting a bit weary and sat down for dinner at one of the many stalls selling food. There was a group of young ladies nearby, and playing the part, I engaged with them in character, and we all sat around talking, laughing, and mildly flirting for about an hour. Seconds after they left, one of them came racing back and whispered, "Our friend really likes you, here's her email address," and thrust a folded piece of paper into my hand, then ran after her friends. Well, so far so good, right? Nothing boosts the ego quite like someone giving you her number unsolicited. And I was quite pleased. But when I got home, the first time I checked my email, there was already an email waiting for me from this young lady. She had been to the festival's webpage and found my details there. I still managed to feel flattery in response to this. And after all, her email was incredibly nice and a little apologetic at taking such a step unsolicited. And she was cute, and had seemed bright and funny when we chatted. So I replied, and we sent a few emails back and forth, mildly flirty, but again, only a few. And when the first nude photos of her showed up in my inbox, several alarm bells went off in the back of my mind, which, being male, I ignored. Wow, how much of a stud are you that some woman you barely know was sending you naked photos of herself? Big self-congratulatory grins and self-backslaps all round. Voices of caution firmly ignored. I got a little bit more flirty, and in response, she went into utter overdrive. The nude photos, which had started out as flirty and artistic, became progressively more explicit, until they were the sort of thing that might even be illegal in Amsterdam. Still flattered, but finding the voice of caution getting louder by this time, I thought it prudent to discuss with her exactly what she thought she was doing. It was around this time that terms like love at first sight, soulmate, and marriage were first uttered. Now, I'm no cad. I don't lead people on with no intention of following through, and I'm certainly not a user of the find 'em, fuck 'em, forget 'em school or any such. But this was a whole other order of magnitude beyond anything I had even considered. And so, attempting to be as diplomatic as possible, I politely declined any further conversation. At this point, it's still a funny anecdote. When she hacked my email account, character assassinated me on a number of online forums and associations I was a member of, it stopped being funny. When she out of the blue called my mother, who she told an amazing story about how I had led her on, made love to her, I never even kissed her, got engaged to her, pressured her to have an abortion, and then left her when she miscarried after giving her nothing more than an STD. I wasn't upset. It was the explosive mother phone call that upset me. Especially since I had no idea that any of this was coming, I was utterly blindsided. She also sent letters outlining a similar story to my employer, the organizers of the festival where we met, and even to trashy current affairs TV shows. Fortunately, most of the people she contacted gave me the benefit of the doubt. Not least because they knew that we lived approximately 800 kilometers apart, and that my easily traceable movements pretty well confirmed that we had only met the once. So yeah. Total bunny boiler. 3. So, small amount of backstory first. I was diagnosed with narcolepsy when I was 16-ish. It's not a huge deal, but sleep has always been an issue for me. Whether it's insomnia or just nodding off at completely inappropriate times. I also typically ride the subway to and from my job, since traffic is super annoying to deal with, and the subway station is within walking distance of my apartment building anyway. I ended up working overtime that night, so obviously I got off work later than what I was used to. It was about 8:30 p.m., so it was kind of dark out as I was making my way to the station. I was just casually making my way downtown, not walking particularly fast, but I was indeed homebound. After a bit of walking, I can hear someone's footsteps behind me. I glanced back to see a pretty normal-looking guy, about 10 feet behind me, staring at his phone. He looked to be around his mid to late 20s, was clean, and was dressed up nicely. Not anything super fancy, but it was obvious he wasn't poor. I didn't think much of it, and just assumed he was another person walking home from work. After I noticed he had been right behind me for 2 blocks now, I decided to try changing up the route I was going, just to make sure nothing weird was going on. He could have been heading to the subway just like me, but I just wanted to be safe. During the last block there, I purposely made an unnecessary turn that pretty much just led in a loop back around to the station, rather than straight towards it. And he went right along with me. For some reason, most likely because I'm very stupid and lack decent reasoning abilities, I decided that turning around and talking to him was a good idea. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have done that. And once more, as it was with my crappy reasoning abilities, I just straight up say, "Are you following me?" The guy stares at me for a moment before laughing and saying he was so focused on what he was doing on his phone, he must have ended up accidentally tailing me. Because I'm gullible, I just believed him on the spot, laughing and saying how I've done that exact thing before. He then turns around and starts walking the opposite direction. I make it to the station safely, wait a little bit for the train to arrive, and then take my seat. It wasn't very crowded inside, probably because it was a weekday and was now somewhere around 9 p.m. I headed straight for the seats that were off in the corner away from the other few people that were there. As I'm waiting for everyone to board so the train can leave, guess who I see walk in? Yep, the guy who was following me earlier. As he walked in, he looked straight at me and took a seat relatively far from me. I didn't think much of it, because he could just be heading home as well. After a few minutes, I started getting really tired. And you guessed it, I accidentally fell asleep in my seat. I really need to start carrying raw coffee grounds with me or something. I couldn't have been asleep for more than 10 minutes or so before I woke up, though. But when I did, it was the creepiest thing. The guy from earlier was now sitting directly across from me. He had his phone held in front of him, obviously taking pictures. He jumped a little when I sat up straight and proceeded with my very eloquent response of, "Whoa, what the?" Now here comes the worst part. He didn't even try to hide that he was taking pictures of me, and instead he looked me right in the eyes and smiled as he said, "I'm sorry. You looked so pretty sleeping." I really wasn't sure how to respond to that, but was creeped out to the max and told him that he needed to delete the pictures he took right now. He apologized and tapped on his phone a few times. Looking back on it, I should have demanded that he show me his phone to prove it. He could have just faked it for all I know. I got up and moved to a different seat, but he just sat there staring and smiling at me the whole time. Luckily, he didn't try to follow me anymore after that. But what he said, in addition to him waiting until I was unconscious to move next to me and take pictures of me, still gives me major heebie-jeebies. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 248. Well, it was November the 5th here tonight. Well, technically it's November the 6th right now. It's about 1:15 in the morning as I'm recording this. But November the 5th, that's always Guy Fawkes night, bonfire night, which always means lots of loud bangs and flashing lights. So that's a headache. But of course it was November the 4th last night, which is not Guy Fawkes night, but that also meant loud bangs and lots of flashing lights. And I expect there'll be much the same tonight as well, because hey, it's fireworks season and they can buy them now when they couldn't the rest of the year. Fair enough if that's what you want to spend your money on, but for the love of God, mate, show some restraint. Anyway, I don't know what was going on tonight, but maybe it was just people getting amped up over all the fireworks. But they've quieted down now, for the most part. But I do hear people off in the distance just randomly shouting into the night. I don't know what the night's done to offend them, but they seem quite displeased about it. Of course, those of you who are enjoying yourselves with fireworks this season, please do be safe, take care, don't burn your fingers and toes and various other things off. Okay, and with that I'm going to head off for now, so until next time, thank you very much for listening and take very good care of yourself.